June 4, 1942, dawned with deceptive calm over the Pacific Ocean. But beneath that tranquility churned forces that would reshape the entire war. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the super battleship Yamato, orchestrating what he believed would be Japan's crowning achievement: annihilation of America's carrier fleet and the capture of Midway Atoll. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor's infamy, and Japan's military machine had devoured territory across Asia and the Pacific with predatory efficiency. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies all had fallen like dominoes before the Imperial Japanese Navy's seemingly unstoppable advance. The Japanese High Command operated under a dangerous illusion born from unbroken victory. Their carriers had struck Pearl Harbor without suffering a single ship lost. They had humiliated the Royal Navy by sinking HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse off Malaya. They controlled an empire stretching from the frozen Aleutians to the tropical jungles of New Guinea, spanning millions of square miles and hundreds of millions of subjugated people. Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, commander of the carrier striking force, had never tasted defeat at sea. His 4 carriers, Kagi, Kaga, Soryu, and here represented the finest naval aviation force the world had ever assembled, manned by veteran pilots whose combat experience dwarfed that of their American counterparts. Yamamoto's plan for Midway reflected both strategic brilliance and fatal overconfidence. He would dispatch a diversionary force to the Aleutian Islands, drawing American attention northward. Meanwhile, his main striking force would pulverize Midway's defenses, forcing Admiral Chester Nimitz to commit his remaining carriers to a desperate relief operation. The Japanese combined fleet would then spring its trap, overwhelming the Americans with superior numbers and destroying what remained of Pacific Fleet carrier aviation. With no carriers to oppose them, Japan could dictate peace terms that would leave them masters of the Pacific for generations. But Yamamoto's intricate chess game contained a fatal flaw he never suspected. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor had achieved something extraordinary. They had cracked the Japanese Navy's JN-25 communications code. Through exhaustive work that often stretched 20 hours per day, Rochefort's team had pierced the veil of Japanese operational security. They knew the target was Midway. They knew the approximate timing. Most critically, they understood the disposition of Japanese forces and Yamamoto's intended approach vectors. Nimitz, a Texan whose calm demeanor masked a gambler's instincts, made the most consequential decision of his career. Rather than reacting to Japanese movements, he would ambush the ambushers. He ordered carriers Enterprise and Hornet, along with the hastily repaired Yorktown, still bearing wounds from the Coral Sea battle fought just weeks earlier 2 positions northeast of Midway. There they would wait, hidden beyond Japanese reconnaissance range, poised to strike when Nagumo's carriers, committed to attacking the atoll. The Americans sailed toward their destiny, understanding the stakes with crystal clarity. Japan possessed 10 carriers to America's 3 at this critical juncture. One miscalculation, one stroke of bad luck, and the Pacific War might become unwinnable. June 3rd descended upon the vast Pacific battlefield, with both sides converging on coordinates that would determine the war's trajectory. Nagumo's Kido Butai steamed eastward through heavy fog banks, maintaining radio silence that Yamamoto believed guaranteed tactical surprise. Aboard Akagi, the flagship air crews conducted final preparations for the dawn strike against Midway. Mechanics checked engines on Nakajima Beefy Van torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A dive bombers, while armorers loaded bombs and ammunition with practiced efficiency. The Japanese approached with formations perfected through years of training and months of combat. Their doctrine emphasized concentration of force. All 4 carriers sailed together, allowing them to launch massive strikes while maintaining robust defensive fighter coverage. Zero fighters, those legendary aircraft that had dominated every opponent they encountered, stood ready to swat American planes from the sky as they had done so many times before. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, selected to lead the first strike wave against Midway, briefed his 108 aircraft on their mission parameters as the fleet pushed through the night. Meanwhile, 300 miles northeast, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown maintained their own radio silence as they reached their ambush positions. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the overall task force from Yorktown, while Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance directed Enterprise and Hornet. Spruance, a cruiser admiral thrust into carrier command due to Vice Admiral William Halsey's hospitalization with severe dermatitis, would prove to be the right man in the right place, despite his lack of aviation experience. The American carrier decks presented a stark contrast to their Japanese counterparts. Many pilots had never seen combat. Their TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were obsolete, slow, and vulnerable death traps that everyone knew would suffer horrific casualties. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers were more capable, but their crews lacked the experience of their Japanese opponents. Only the Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters could match the Zero in certain performance parameters. Though they remained inferior in maneuverability, yet the Americans possessed advantages their enemy never fully appreciated. Their doctrine emphasized flexibility and independent action by squadron and group commanders. According to Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive history, The Two-Ocean War, American naval aviation had evolved rapidly, learning from early defeats and adapting tactics with pragmatic urgency. More importantly, the Americans knew exactly where their enemy would be, while Nagumo remained ignorant of the American carrier's presence at Midway itself. Defenders prepared for the onslaught they knew was coming. Marines manning anti-aircraft batteries and obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters understood they faced Japan's elite. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon's ground forces had transformed the tiny atoll into a bristling fortress. But everyone recognized the Japanese carrier air power would exact a terrible price. PBY Catalina patrol planes launched into pre-dawn darkness, their crews scanning endless ocean for the enemy fleet as June 4th arrived. Three forces converged on collision course, Nagumo's carriers approaching from the northwest, the American carriers waiting in ambush to the northeast, and Midway's defenders preparing to sell their lives dearly. The sun rose over waters that would soon run red with blood and oil, illuminating the stage for history's most pivotal carrier battle. At 4:30 in the morning, Tomonaga's strike force roared from the Japanese carrier decks into the strengthening dawn. The thunderous launch operations proceeded with mechanical precision born from countless repetitions. Within 15 minutes, 108 aircraft formed up and set course for Midway, their engines droning across the empty ocean. Nagumo retained a powerful reserve force aboard his carrier's 93 aircraft armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, held ready to attack any American ships that might unexpectedly appear. At 5:34, a PBY Catalina, piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80, spotted the incoming Japanese strike and transmitted the warning that galvanized Midway's defenses. Every operational aircraft on the atoll scrambled -20-6 fighters, 4 Army Beat-1A6 Marauders, 6 Navy TBF Avengers, and various other aircraft launched to attack the Japanese carriers or simply escape destruction on the ground. The Marines and soldiers manning ground defenses took cover and prepared for hell itself to descend upon them. Tomonaga's strike wave slammed into Midway at 6:30, and for the next 20 minutes, the atoll disappeared beneath explosions and flames. Japanese bombers methodically destroyed facilities, while Zeros massacred the defending fighters. The obsolete Buffaloes stood no chance. 17 were shot down, with most of the rest damaged beyond repair. But Midway's defenders inflicted damage too, and critically, the installations survived well enough to remain operational. Tomonaga radioed back a message that would doom his fleet. There is need for a second attack. While Midway burned, American carrier planes were already airborne, hunting for the Japanese fleet. Spruance had launched his strike groups earlier than Fletcher, gambling that catching Nagumo's carriers while they recovered the Midway attack force offered the best chance for success. This decision demonstrated the aggressive instincts that would make Spruance one of America's greatest admirals. Hornet's strike group totaling 59 aircraft departed first, followed by Enterprise's strike force of similar size. Nagumo now faced a commander's nightmare. Tomonaga's message indicated Midway required another attack, but his reserve aircraft were armed for attacking ships. At 7:15, Nagumo made the fatal decision to rearm the reserve strike force with land attack bombs to finish Midway. Ordnance crews swarmed over the
hangar decks, removing torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, replacing them with high-explosive land bombs. The process was laborious and time-consuming. Leaving heavy ordnance stacked haphazardly across the decks, then disaster struck Japanese planning. At 7:28, a reconnaissance float plane from the cruiser Tone launched late due to catapult problems reported sighting American ships. Nagumo demanded clarification. Were carriers present? Agonizing minutes passed while the scout pilot maneuvered for better observation. Meanwhile, waves of Midway-based torpedo bombers and bombers attacked Nagumo's fleet, inflicting no damage but disrupting operations and forcing constant maneuvering. At 8:20, the Tone scout finally reported, "Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier." Nagumo's world inverted instantly. American carriers, the very targets he sought, were here, positioned to attack him. He ordered the reserve strike force rearmed again, this time back to ship attack weapons. Chaos engulfed the hangar decks as exhausted ordnance crews reversed their earlier work. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs brought back out while land bombs were unstowed and returned to magazines. The vulnerability window had opened. At 9:20, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet toward their destiny. Waldron, part Oglala Sioux, possessed an aggressive temperament and uncanny navigational instincts. When Hornet's Air Group commander led most of the strike force on a southwest course that would miss the Japanese fleet entirely, Waldron broke formation and took his 15 TBD Devastators on a more westerly heading that proved exactly correct. He was leading his men to glory and death in equal measure. The TBD Devastator represented obsolete technology forced into modern combat. It lumbered through the air at barely 115 miles per hour when carrying its torpedo, making it hideously vulnerable to fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Its defensive armament consisted of one forward-firing .30 caliber machine gun and one flexible .30 caliber gun for the rear gunner pop guns against the Japanese fleet's ferocious defensive fire. The outdated Mark 13 torpedoes they carried often malfunctioned, adding insult to the injury of near-suicidal attack requirements. Waldron's squadron approached, the Japanese fleet utterly alone. The fighter escorts that should have protected them had followed Hornet's Air Group commander on the wrong heading. Waldron's dive bombers were similarly separated. The 15 Devastators faced the entire Kido Butai without support for carriers. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all bristling with anti-aircraft guns, plus 36 Zero fighters. At 9:25, the Zeros pounced. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya led his fighters down like hunting hawks, and the slaughter commenced. According to Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, published in 1967 and drawing from extensive interviews with survivors from both sides, the Zeros ripped through Torpedo 8 with methodical brutality. Machine guns hammered aluminum airframes. Fuel tanks exploded into orange fireballs. One by one, the Devastators tumbled burning into the Pacific. Waldron's aircraft was among the first hit. Flames engulfed the cockpit, but he remained at the controls long enough to keep his torpedo run steady before the TBD cartwheeled into the ocean. Ensign George Gay watched his squadron mates die around him as he pressed his attack toward Akagi. His aircraft shuddered under Zero gunfire. His turret gunner, Robert Huntington, was killed. Gay released his torpedo and seconds later crashed into the ocean as his Devastator disintegrated around him. He would be the squadron's sole survivor. By 9:40, every aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 had been destroyed. 30 men were dead or dying. Not a single torpedo hit its target. The squadron had been annihilated without inflicting any damage whatsoever on the enemy. It appeared to be a complete and tragic waste of brave men's lives, but Torpedo 8's sacrifice was not in vain. They had pulled the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top level, drawing the Zeros away from high altitude where American dive bombers approached unseen. They had forced Nagumo's carriers to maneuver violently, disrupting landing operations and extending the vulnerable period when aircraft crowded the decks awaiting launch. They had bought time, paid for in blood, minutes after Torpedo 8's destruction. Torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown pressed their own attacks with equal courage and similar results. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown suffered similar devastation. The American torpedo bomber force was being gutted, crew after crew pressing attacks they knew were suicidal. Men flying deliberately to their deaths because duty and honor demanded it, the Zero pilots, low on fuel and ammunition, had spent themselves destroying the torpedo bombers. The Japanese carriers' decks remained packed with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Ordnance crews worked desperately to prepare the strike force that would destroy the American carriers. Nagumo's flagship Akagi was moments away from launching. Then American dive bombers arrived overhead. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed over into his dive from 14,000 feet. His Enterprise dive bomber squadron had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, fuel gauges dropping toward critically low levels, when he spotted the destroyer Arashi racing to rejoin the main fleet after prosecuting a submarine contact. McCluskey followed the destroyer's wake like a pointer arrow straight to the carriers. Below him, the Kido Butai presented a target beyond any pilot's wildest dreams. 4 carriers steamed in close formation, their decks absolutely crowded with aircraft. Fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes packed tightly together. Fuel lines snaked across the decks, servicing aircraft for imminent launch. Ordnance carts loaded with bombs and torpedoes sat clustered near each plane. The hangar decks held additional aircraft and mountains of ordnance. All 4 carriers turned into the wind, preparing to launch the massive strike that would destroy the American fleet. They were at their most vulnerable possible moment. McCluskey assigned targets with quick decisions that demonstrated superb tactical instinct. He would take his squadron against Kaga while his wingman squadron attacked Akagi to the south. Yorktown's dive bombers under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie had independently located the enemy and positioned themselves to attack Soryu, 3 American dive bomber. Squadrons arrived over the Japanese carriers. Simultaneously, through sheer chance and fortune, the Japanese had no high-altitude fighter cover. Every Zero had been pulled down to sea level, destroying torpedo bombers. The combat air patrol was out of position, low on fuel, and scattered across miles of ocean. At 10:24, McCluskey's first section dove on Kaga. Lieutenant Dick Best led his section toward Akagi, pushing past other dive bombers to ensure both carriers received proper attention. The SBD Dauntlesses screamed down at 270 miles per hour, split-flap dive brakes howling. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the fleet, throwing up walls of steel and explosive shells, but the American pilots bored through the defensive fire with grim determination. The first bomb struck Kaga near the bridge at 10:25. The 500-pound explosive detonated amid the massed aircraft, and the carrier disappeared beneath a volcanic eruption of flame and destruction. The bombers lined up on deck exploded. Fuel fires spread instantly across the wooden deck. Within seconds, 3 more bombs struck Kaga in rapid succession. One penetrated to the hangar deck, where it detonated among fully fueled and armed aircraft, triggering secondary explosions that ripped through the ship's vitals. According to Mark E. Stills, The Imperial Japanese Navy in the Pacific War, published by Osprey Publishing, Kaga's damage control teams were overwhelmed within minutes. The fires spread faster than any crew could possibly contain. While Kaga died, Lieutenant Best put his bomb directly onto Akagi's flight deck. The explosion penetrated to the hangar, where it found the rearmed strike aircraft heavy with fuel and ordnance. A cataclysmic secondary blast tore through Japan's premier carrier. Torpedoes cooked off. Aviation gasoline fed fires that quickly reached temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge watching his flagship transformed into an inferno. All communication systems failed. The ship's rudder jammed, causing Akagi to circle helplessly while flames consumed her from within. Simultaneously, Yorktown's dive bombers struck Soryu with deadly precision. 3 bombs hit in quick succession, each one finding aircraft and ordnance on the crowded deck. Soryu exploded as violently as her sister ships. Fire consumed the
carrier from stem to stern. Her captain, Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to abandon ship and went down with his vessel later that afternoon. In 5 minutes, perhaps less, the balance of Pacific naval power shifted irreversibly. 3 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks, their veteran air crews killed or scattered, their irreplaceable aircraft destroyed. Years of training and experience were being incinerated. Half a year of Japanese victory reversed in the time it takes to make coffee. Only Hiru remained operational. Captain Tomiokaku commanded Hiru, the sole surviving carrier of Nagumo's once invincible striking force. As smoke pillars marked the funeral pyres of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, Kaku launched an immediate counterstrike. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, the carrier division commander, and perhaps Japan's most brilliant naval aviation officer, ordered an attack with every available aircraft, despite knowing his single carrier faced at least 2 American flat tops. Yamaguchi embodied the samurai spirit that made Japan so formidable and ultimately so tragic: absolute refusal to accept defeat, attacking against any odds because honor demanded it. At 10:40, 18 IHE De-3 Valdive bombers, escorted by 6 Zeros launched from Hiryu, Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, led this scratch force composed of whatever aircraft could be made ready on short notice. They flew eastward, searching for the Americans who had inflicted such catastrophic damage. The Japanese pilots understood their mission was likely one way even if they survived the attack. Finding Hiryu again would be nearly impossible, and fuel limitations meant ditching in the ocean was probable. They flew anyway. At 12:10, Kobayashi's strike found Yorktown. The carrier's radar detected the incoming Japanese at 40 miles, providing crucial warning time. Fighter director officers vectored every available Wildcat toward the threat. A savage aerial battle erupted as Wildcats tore into the VAL formation. American pilots shot down several dive bombers, but the Japanese pressed through with fanatic determination. Yorktown's anti-aircraft guns opened up, filling the sky with exploding shells and tracer fire. At 12:20, VALs broke through the fighter screen and dove on Yorktown. The carrier maneuvered violently, heeling over in radical turns that had crew members holding on for their lives. The first bomb hit near the island's superstructure, penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. The blast killed or wounded dozens of men and started serious fires. A second bomb struck moments later, tearing through the flight deck and exploding in the hangar. A third bomb hit near the smokestack, rupturing the boiler uptakes and flooding fire rooms with smoke and fumes. Yorktown's boilers shut down, and the carrier coasted to a halt, dead in the water, burning and listing. Yet Yorktown's crew demonstrated American damage control excellence. Within 2 hours, repair parties had contained the fires, restored boiler power, and corrected the list. By 1440, Yorktown was making 19 knots and recovering aircraft. She seemed to have survived Hiryu's first strike. Then Japanese eyes on the horizon spotted the carrier underway again and reported Yorktown as a different, undamaged ship, leading Yamaguchi to believe he faced 3 American carriers rather than 2. At 13:30, Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led this attack despite being wounded in the morning's Midway strike. His aircraft damaged and leaking fuel, he knew he wouldn't return but flew anyway, demonstrating the suicidal courage that characterized Japanese naval aviation. His obsolete aircraft would never find Hiru again, even if he survived the attack. Tominaga flew to his death as matter-of-factly as another man might walk to his office. At 1440, radar detected Tominaga's formation inbound. Yorktown launched additional fighters and turned into the wind to recover aircraft caught on deck during the earlier attack. The carrier was crowded and vulnerable when the Kates came boring in from multiple directions. Again, Wildcats savaged the attackers, shooting down many, but torpedo bombers penetrated the defense screen. At 1444, 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side. The massive underwater explosions tore enormous holes in the carrier's hull. Engineering spaces flooded. All power failed. Yorktown took on a severe list that worsened rapidly. By 1500 hours, the list exceeded 26 degrees, making further damage control impossible. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandoned ship. Yorktown would survive this grievous damage, remaining afloat for 2 more days before a Japanese submarine finally sent her down. But she was finished as a fighting unit. Hiryu had struck back hard, even as Yorktown's crew abandoned their stricken ship. American retribution was already airborne. Enterprise and Hornet had launched strike groups hunting for the 4th Japanese carrier. Scout planes located Hiryu at 1445, transmitting her position to the incoming American squadrons. 24 dive bombers from Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, along with 16 from Hornet, converged on Japan's last operational carrier. Hiryu steamed alone. Separated from the burning hulks of her sister ships, her crew worked frantically to prepare another strike wave, determined to inflict more damage on the Americans. Zeros circled overhead, but the combat air patrol was thin after 2 strike missions and constant defensive scrambles. Admiral Yamaguchi knew American. Dive bombers would come. The question was whether Hiryu could launch her strike before they arrived, at 1700 hours precisely. Gallagher pushed over into his dive. Once again, American dive bombers dropped from high altitude onto a Japanese carrier whose attention focused elsewhere. Once again, the SPD Dauntlesses screamed down through anti-aircraft fire with grim purpose. The attack lasted perhaps 3 minutes. 4 bombs struck Hiryu's flight deck in rapid succession. The first bomb detonated near the forward elevator, blowing it completely off its frame and sending it tumbling into the hangar. Secondary blasts followed as fueled and armed aircraft exploded. Fires erupted across the carrier, spreading through the hangar bay with terrible speed. Hiryu's damage control parties fought with desperate courage. But the fires were beyond control. Magazines began cooking off. The carrier's entire forward section became an inferno, reaching temperatures that melted steel. By evening, Hiryu was a burning wreck, all 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. Japan's elite carrier striking force, the Kido, Butai that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had been annihilated in a single afternoon. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring reports from his flagship Yamato, absorbed the catastrophic news with outward stoicism. All 4 carriers lost. Thousands of irreplaceable aircrew dead. The entire strategic premise of the Midway operation had disintegrated. He briefly considered bringing his battleships forward to force a night surface engagement, but the Americans wisely declined to pursue into waters where Japanese battleship superiority could reverse the day's verdict. In the early hours of June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order that acknowledged reality: the combined fleet would withdraw. Japan's first major defeat was complete. Kaga sank that evening. Soryu went down at 1913 on June 4th. Akagi and Hiryu, both burning uncontrollably, were scuttled by Japanese destroyers on June 5th. With them went approximately 3,000 officers and men, including hundreds of veteran pilots whose experience could never be replaced. The Americans had paid a serious price. Yorktown lost. Along with the destroyer Hammond sunk while attempting to save the carrier, 145 American aircraft destroyed, 307 men killed. But these losses were acceptable, even light, compared to the strategic earthquake they had achieved. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men, including many of the finest naval aviators in the world. The Battle of Midway shattered Japan's offensive capability. Never again would the Imperial Japanese Navy possess sufficient carrier strength to dominate the Pacific. The 6-month rampage of conquest was finished. Japan would fight on for 3 more years with skill and savage courage. But Midway marked the point where ultimate defeat became inevitable. The wreckage of Japan's carrier, force settling to the Pacific floor, represented far more than sunken ships. The Kido Butai had been Japan's sword arm, the instrument of empire, the formation that enabled everything achieved since Pearl Harbor. In 6 months, those 4 carriers had roamed across 1/3 of the Earth's surface, striking targets from Hawaii to Ceylon, sinking 5 battleships, 1 carrier, 2 cruisers, 7 destroyers, and dozens of other vessels. While destroying hundreds of Allied aircraft, they had done this while suffering negligible losses themselves, creating an aura of invincibility around Japanese carrier aviation. Midway destroyed that aura permanently. More critically, it destroyed something irreplaceable: the veteran aircrew who had trained together for years before the war. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, who fought at Midway and analyzed the battle extensively afterward, noted that Japan could build new carriers, but producing pilots of equivalent skill required years Japan no longer possessed: the experienced dive bomber pilots who could consistently put bombs on target, the torpedo bomber crews, who had perfected low-altitude attacks, the fighter pilots who had shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft. These men could not be replaced by simply training new recruits. Japan's production capacity, already strained, could not replace 4 fleet carriers quickly. The Shikaku and Zuikaku, absent from Midway due to damage and aircraft losses from the Coral Sea battle, would shoulder Japanese carrier operations for months. New carriers under construction would not enter service until 1943 and 1944, arriving in 1s and 2s rather than as a concentrated striking force. Meanwhile, American shipyards were producing Essex-class carriers in assembly line fashion. The USS Essex herself would commission in December 1942 as the first of 24 sisters that would flood the Pacific with American carrier power. The strategic initiative shifted irrevocably. Before Midway, Japan chose where and when to fight. After Midway, America seized that prerogative. In August 1942, just 2 months after Midway, American forces invaded Guadalcanal, beginning the long, grinding offensive that would ultimately reach Japan's home islands. Japan would win some tactical victories. The carrier Wasp sunk. Hornet destroyed at Santa Cruz, but these were defensive battles fought on terms America chose, and the attrition math favored the United States overwhelmingly. Admiral Nimitz understood Midway's significance immediately. He wrote in his after-action report that the battle restored the balance of naval power in the Pacific and noted that American forces could now transition from defensive operations to offensive action. The psychological impact was equally important. 10 American forces had met Japan's best and destroyed them. The myth of Japanese invincibility died in the smoke above those 4 burning carriers. Japan's military and political leadership struggled to process the disaster. The battle's details were suppressed from the Japanese public and even from much of the military. Survivors were quarantined and silenced. The official narrative emphasized American losses while minimizing Japanese casualties. This self-deception prevented honest assessment of what had gone wrong and delayed necessary reforms to doctrine and training. The fatal arrogance that characterized Japanese planning at Midway, dividing forces, inadequate reconnaissance, rigid adherence to plan despite changing circumstances, would plague Japanese operations throughout the war. The assumption of superiority, the belief that fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage, the refusal to acknowledge reality until catastrophe was undeniable. These attitudes cost Japan dearly across 3 more years of escalating defeat. By June 4th, 1945, exactly 3 years after Midway, American bombers were burning Japanese cities to ashes while submarines strangled the home islands with total blockade. The Kido Butai's wreckage on the Pacific floor had become Japan's epitaph. Midway proved that dominance built on aggression and skill could shatter instantly when confronting an enemy who refused to concede defeat, who learned from disaster, who possessed industrial might to replace losses and return stronger. The 4 carriers lost at Midway Akagi, Kaga Soryu, and Hiro represented the apex and termination of Japan's carrier power. They had written 6 months of stunning victories before meeting annihilation in 5 minutes of American dive bombers. Their destruction demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare: technology, intelligence, and industrial capacity ultimately overwhelm even the most skilled warriors when directed by determined leadership. Japan's dominance had indeed proved fragile when Midway unleashed hell without mercy. And from that hell emerged the pathway to Japan's eventual surrender and the end of history's most destructive war.